Good morning. It's good to be back home. We had a good trip, but it's nice to be back worshiping with all of you. And I want to take just a brief moment to express my thanks for all the support, encouragement, and generosity of all of you for Faith and I over the past few weeks. I'm truly grateful, especially for the time that you had with TJ and Eric while I was gone. They can share their wisdom from the pulpit with you these last 2 Sundays. I know I'm grateful for their willingness to step in, and it seems all is well. I didn't receive any nasty notes from the substitutes on my desk when I got back to work, so I'll count that as a win. I know you survived Protestant Reformation Sunday without any holes in doors, and there's no orders to be nailed to the walls, so I think everything's fine. This morning, before we jump back into Hebrews, though, a brief reminder for all of us of where we've been over the last several weeks. This particular letter comes with many challenges, some obstacles that we need to be aware of so that we can successfully navigate our way through it. Even before we read, there's the challenge of authorship and audience. Not sure who wrote the letter or whom it was written. All we know is that it seems universally addressed to a Christian audience with some kind of Jewish heritage. But it isn't quite that simple either. This Christian audience with Jewish heritage also seems very well versed in Greek philosophy, especially Neoplatonism. It means that for us to properly mine the wisdom of this letter, to fully understand the author, it helps to have some working knowledge of Greek philosophy, a little bit of ancient Judaism, and some of fledgling Christian history. If you want to take that crash course, I can give you the proper reading list, but for the purpose of today's text, I just want to point out one particular detail. Neoplatonism has a particular school of philosophy with a broad audience, a wide range of impact. Pretty much everyone in the Greco-Roman world at the time of writing would not have only known what Neoplatonism was, they would have subscribed to at least some of its teachings. As a philosophy, it was universal, it was accessible, enough so that it has been attested to throughout history across pretty much every demographic line. It didn't matter what language you spoke in the Greco-Roman Empire, what age you were, from preschool to ancient Roman retirement homes, everybody was a Neoplatonist. Everybody who was anybody understood at least some of Neoplatonism. And even Jesus quotes Plato in the Gospel of John. Everybody was a Platonist. But what was it? Well, the short answer is to say that it was a revised and updated version of Plato's teachings and his allegories. I doubt that does much for any of us before our coffee kicked in. Over the years, Plato's philosophy had been debated, picked at, picked on, and it came through the other side fresh, popular, and trendy. The average person probably didn't agree with all of it, but they could at least find something agreeable in the teachings of Plato because the man wrote about everything. More importantly, culture itself was saturated with Plato. Even if an individual person did not consider themselves a Platonist, they lived in a culture that was. So for the letter to the Hebrews, that means that the verses we read from chapter 9 today are at least a little Platonic, the truest sense of the word, at least in one particular way. One of the fundamental assertions of Plato was that the universe mirrored itself, particularly that earth mirrored heaven, or more generally, that the physical world was a mirror of the spiritual world. It's a complicated dualism that not only separates the spiritual from the physical, but it also considers the physical world to be a lesser copy of the spiritual world. I would guess you know this aspect of Platonism best from the allegory of the cave. There have been many variations and versions of the allegory of the cave, but for the relevance of these verses in Hebrews, here's the short of it. Suppose there was a person who lived their entire life in a cave with their back always to the entrance, never seeing anything outside of the cave. The sun would cast shadows into the cave, but the person was able to see the world only ever as shadow. This, Plato proposed, is how humans exist in a physical world that is merely an imprint, suggestion, or a mere shadow of the actual world that exists in a spiritual state. If If you don't want the crash course reading list, go home and watch at least the first Matrix movie. You get pretty much the same. It's this idea that everything you experience is just some sort of a dream of reality. None of it's quite real, but it all is a little real. It was a popular proposition. Practically everyone in the Greco-Roman world bought into it at least a little, because it was easy to believe when things are awful that things could be better somewhere else. This particular Jewish audience would have bought into this even more so. When Moses was given instructions on how to build a tabernacle, and later Solomon the temple, God made it clear that the tabernacle and the temple were copies modeled after the original in heaven. Isaiah has a vision that would later affirm the position, and even Revelation makes the same kind of claim. It was common Jewish belief long before Plato was trendy that the earth, especially the temple, mirrored heaven. So for this Christian, Jewish, Neoplatonist audience, the author of Hebrews writes in chapter 9 about the crucifixion. But when he tells the story of Jesus' death, he tells the original, the more true version, more spiritual version of the story. That's not to say that the story we know from the Gospels isn't true, but from two different philosophies that both propose that the spiritual is somehow more authentic, more real, or more meaningful than anything we experience in this physical world. These verses in Hebrews 9 tell the story of the crucifixion from the perspective of the spiritual, with a different emphasis from the Gospels. So listen again to these 4 verses that we read earlier, but this time with your Jewish Neoplatonic ears. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. For then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, that's the reality part of this, as it really is. He has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, after that the judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. I hope you can see this story now for what it is. It's simply the story of the cross. It's the story of atonement. But it's being told in a different kind of way to make a different kind of statement. The author is using the traditions of Plato and Judaism to help us see something particular. Now, Jesus has been the topic of this whole letter up to this point. And the author has spent considerable effort trying to show us how unique Jesus is in all of creation. Unlike John, who spent his letters pointing out how much Jesus, God incarnate, was just like everyone else, the author of Hebrews has gone out of the way to point out how uniquely different Jesus is. Not an angel, but higher than angels. Not just a priest, but a high priest. Not just a high priest, but a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And here, not just a sacrifice, but a perfect heavenly sacrifice. In this version of the story, the cross isn't even specifically named. Rather, all the emphasis is on the sacrifice itself. Jesus here doesn't just die on earth, but presents himself in the true temple, in the presence of God, offering not just a sacrifice, but the perfect sacrifice of his own life. And unlike other sacrifices in the earthly temple, Jesus' own sacrifice of his own life was a single sacrifice that would last for all time. It doesn't need to be repeated over and over, year after year. He is a unique, perfect sacrifice every way. I imagine you know all that already. I would guess you're wondering why I detoured you on a scenic route through Neoplatonism just to tell you something you already know. There is a reason. Hold on a little longer. As you know, in 70 CE, Rome destroyed the city of Jerusalem, utterly sacked it, especially the temple. Judaism, as an institution, barely survived, scattered and somewhat dissolved. The priests were either killed or imprisoned or went into hiding. No more sacrifices were being made in the temple because there wasn't a temple to make them in or people to give them. The people scattered too, hopeless and helpless, not knowing what their future had in store, if anything. And Christians were very much a part of that as well. At that point in time, Christianity was not a separate religion, but it was a denomination within Judaism. The destruction of the temple, the power and the victory of Rome, the scattering of the people outside of the promised land, it all affected Christians just as much, if not more in some ways, as it did the rest of Judaism. It cast a certain shadow of doubt, some of the things that Jesus had been saying. People remembered Jesus saying that he would come back to save them. But if he didn't come back when Jerusalem was destroyed, really come back at all. They remembered his promise that some would not die before they saw the kingdom of God, but so many had died already. They heard rumors about destroying the temple, but the rumor was that Jesus would rebuild it in 3 days. The problem was, years went by. It was still just a pile of rubble. Christians developed a lot of doubt about Jesus in the years following the destruction of the temple. And so the author of Hebrews wrote a letter. You see, all that philosophy that I dragged you through was absolutely necessary to make the point Jesus isn't like the priests who were in Jerusalem. And his sacrifice isn't anything like their sacrifices. Unlike them, Jesus didn't scatter. Unlike them, his sacrifice was still powerful and effective. The temple on the earth was gone. The priestly system scattered. No more sacrifices were being made. But Jesus entered the temple not made of human hands, but the one in heaven, the one that cannot be destroyed or sacked, and offered a sacrifice that would last once for all time. You see, the author wants you to know that while the earth descends into chaos and destruction, hatred and evil, when literally everything is falling apart around you, Jesus and his love and his sacrifice are secure, and they are sure in the very throne room of God. Everything else might be destroyed or taken or lost, but the sacrifice of Jesus can never be removed from us because he is different than everything here on earth. He did not just die on the earth, but when he did, he presented himself heaven as a sacrifice for our sins. And because he is different, because Jesus and his sacrifice are reliable, effective, indestructible, the author of Hebrews also wants us to know that we can count on his promise to return, save all of us from all of this. As surely as he came the first time, and as surely as he presented himself as a sacrifice in heaven, Jesus is coming again. And thanks to all of the philosophy earlier, the author is also saying that the return of Jesus is actually even more reliable and more effectual and more powerful than any of the pain or suffering or hardship on earth. As real as the destruction of the temple was, the return of Jesus is even more assured and more powerful. If this were Plato's cave, essentially the author of Hebrews is saying that the destruction of the temple, the hatred, the discrimination, the wars, the famines, the pandemic, all of it, just merely a shadow compared to the reality of the promise of Jesus returning to save us from all of those things that scare us in the dark. Everything that we know pales in comparison to the truth and the realization of Jesus returning to us. But you have to hold on, endure a little longer, and don't give up. He's really coming. And you can believe that because of who he is, because of what he's done, because of how he's done it. Hold on just a little longer. Even though the pandemic feels like it's already lasted long enough, and even though you think 2 world wars might have been enough, and even though you think it couldn't ever get any worse, and then somehow you wake up and the news starts telling you it's worse. All of that, all of it, no matter how real it feels, no matter how insurmountable it all seems, none of it means anything when compared to Jesus who died not on a cross, but to present himself in heaven, where true life really is, where the things that matter really are, where reality is realistic as ever be. Truthfully, I hope you're not sold on Neoplatonism, because as I can call it Neoplatonism, it's not that new anymore. We've come a long way since then. I don't necessarily prescribe or recommend it, but I think it helps us see the point just a little bit more clearly. We get so focused and so laser-sighted on the things that are wrong in our life and the things that are going wrong in the world. We start to wonder if Jesus will ever really come back. But you have to hold on a little longer. Not quite Christmas yet. I know it needs to stay in its lane, but I'm ready. I've had my first Starbucks creme brulee coffee, and I've already watched Elf once. I am already ready for Christmas. You can all hate me for it, and that's fine. But ultimately, I think that's what the author of Hebrews wants you to hear. He really is coming. You just have to hold on a little longer. As surely as we celebrate his death, surely one day we'll celebrate his coming again. There's hope to be found in his death. What a strange thing to say amidst so much death in the world. I don't know which part of that you needed to hear, that it's okay to put up your Christmas decorations, or that it's okay to hope that Jesus is coming back. But somewhere in the middle, I hope you heard something good, something you can latch onto. And if you need a little bit more of that hope, that permission to watch Elf, then the elders will be in the back, ready to pray with you, or to pray for you, or over the things in your life. I know I joke, but do take them up on the offer. They really do care, and they really do want to be able to help you see the hope that we share together at points in our life when it's darkest and hardest to see it. Let us stand and sing.